Raphael Warnock has been a friend for a while. We, as I mentioned, shared a period of time in Baltimore when he was at Douglas Community Church. And Brad Braxton was there before him, if you know Brad Braxton. So he's followed in the steps of a lot of luminaries. And Raphael is a graduate of Morehouse College. There we go. And we share something else in common. He's also a graduate of the Summer Leadership Institute of Harvard University. I did that too, so we're both Harvard grads. It's a 2-week thing, it's not that. But, we were classmates at Harvard. I'll bet he claims Morehouse than he claims Harvard, is my guess. 3 degrees from Union Theological Seminary in New York, MDiv, Master of Philosophy, and a PhD. He did his work with James Cone, who was, I was going to say, one of the great African-American theologians, I would say the great, just passed away. His works have changed the whole fabric of the way we do theology now, and so he did his PhD with Cone, and while he was there, was at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. He was on the staff there. Just as an aside, a group here is reading a book by Reggie Williams called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, which is about Bonhoeffer's experience of the Abyssinian Baptist Church and how it changed the way he saw things. And so when he went back to Germany, it was a different person. And so what that book does is it brings out how significant it was in changing the framework of the way he understood things and the way he understood what was going on in his own country. So Abyssinian Baptist, he came directly to Baltimore from Abyssinian Baptist and then went to Ebenezer Baptist, the historic Ebenezer Baptist, the spiritual home of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Raphael has been named as the 55 most powerful people in Atlanta, the top 20 African-American leaders in the country, 10 most influential black ministers, and I don't doubt that a bit. We're so happy and proud to have Raphael Warnock, the Reverend Doctor. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you so very much. I'm grateful to be here at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. I come to D.C. quite a bit. I've seen this church many times. I've thought about its history and its meaning and the fact that Roger Gench, with whom I served for a year in Baltimore, down the street, our churches were down the street, serves here. But I'm grateful to be here with you this morning as a part of this McClendon Scholars series. Weren't we blessed by the witness of the ambassadors of praise? Grateful for them and their ministry under the leadership of Pastor Brown. Thank you so much, Dr. Gench. I'm grateful to be here in this amazing and historic church that is really woven into the fabric of our nation. I hope to go upstairs or downstairs, sit in the Lincoln pew where Peter Marshall stood and preached, and now the Reverend Dr. Roger Gench. Give God praise for this leadership and servant in this house. I told him I still remember one of his Good Friday sermons, although that was way back in 2002. And as he described with great clarity and imagination his journey as a hiker and connecting that to the spiritual journey. Many friends are here. I'm grateful. The Reverend Brandon Harris is a young man I'm very proud of. He's a member of Ebenezer Baptist Church, and is the Protestant chaplain at Georgetown University. Stand up, Brandon. Reverend Brandon Harris. And of course, we have folks who are connected to the Ebenezer Church in so many ways. I'm grateful for the good people from Metropolitan AME Church. I was once invited to preach at Metropolitan, and I couldn't make it, and so I'm still waiting on that second invitation. Tell your pastor I said hello. And how refreshing it is to see these young men. Future leadership and the hope of our nation. We're counting on you. Stand up, let us see you one more time. I want you to know we're counting on you. Will you bow with me in prayer? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. The Lord called even in the midst of the prayer. I'm grateful. I want to talk to you about unfinished business. Unfinished business. We remember Martin Luther King Jr., particularly in a moment like this, a moment in which our nation seems besieged and trapped in an endless reality television show that would be funny if it were not so tragic. We remember Martin Luther King Jr. How we long to stand on some high and lofty mountain just to see his star flash across the distance and settle all too soon on the horizon. Has anybody seen our friend Martin? Many observances this year, but we must be certain that we do not turn the dream or cash in the dream for sentimental memories. MLK 50 is, to be sure, a celebration of his life, but more importantly, it's a recommitment to what his life represented. 50 years ago, this past February, 2 Memphis sanitation workers, Echo Cole and Robert Walker, were literally crushed to death in the back of a sanitation truck where they sought shelter from a storm. They were there because black sanitation workers, imagine this, in 1968, were prohibited from riding in the truck with their white counterparts. Remember, this is 1968. That means the Public Accommodations Bill of 1964 had already passed. The Voting Rights Law of 1965 had already passed, and yet they were subjected to the brutal logic of Jim Crow segregation. And their bodies were literally crushed in the unrelenting power and machinery of white supremacy. They were seeking shelter from the storm, but there was no shelter from the unnatural disaster of racism. And so their bodies were crushed, and that was the latest blow in a long pattern of neglect and abuse. And their bodies literally gave fuel to a fledgling Memphis movement that had been trying to get off the ground. The church finally got really engaged, the black church. And these iconic signs emerged. I am a man. Think about that. Simple and sublime, an affirmation that speaks to the depth of the tragedy of our separation. I am a man. One of the characteristics of being an oppressed person is that you have to have a movement. You have to have a campaign. You have to have a theology to affirm about yourself that which other people take for granted. I am a man. Sojourner Truth saying in the 19th century, asking with rhetorical power, ain't I a woman? Of late, young people, red, yellow, brown, black, and white, responding to the tragedy of police brutality, which is really the tip of the spear of mass incarceration, with the controversial phrase, Black Lives Matter. Controversial. So if you ask, why do you have to say Black Lives Matter? Don't all lives matter? If you have to ask, why have a Black History Month? And then you ask, what do you mean by white privilege? Well, you've answered your second question by asking the first question. You'll catch that later on. One of the marks of being an oppressed person is that you have to have a movement to declare about yourself that which ought to be obvious. And so that attracted to Memphis, weary and worn out, Martin Luther King Jr., and there he stepped out of history and into eternity. I submit 50 years later that we do need a revolution of values, that we've got unfinished business, that our work is to carry forth what he called the triplet evils of racism, poverty, and war. I know these are tough times. It's difficult to figure out really what to do. But faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Dr. King said faith is taking the first step even when you can't see the whole stairwell. And so analysis is important, but sometimes we get caught up in the paralysis of analysis. That's how systemic oppression works. You don't quite know who to blame. It's not about blaming a person. Racism is not about whether this person likes me or not. It's about your ability to decide through public policy the implications, the tragic consequences of my life. And so Dr. King stepped out on faith. I have the great benefit of living in Atlanta, and so I was born a year after Dr. King's death, but Many of his closest lieutenants I know. I spend time with them. I've talked to them in their living rooms, and they've shared the pulpit with me in my church. And Andy Young and Joe Lowry and John Lewis and so many others will tell you that they weren't sure, Roger, what they were doing. They just knew they had to do something. So they just stepped out on faith. By faith, Martin Luther King Jr. stood up when Rosa Parks decided to sit down. By faith, he left the comfort of a pulpit and made the whole world his parish. By faith, he taught us to meet brute force with soul force, to harness indignation to discipline, to protest with the creative weapon of love and nonviolence. By faith, he dreamed a dream for America, believing that one day the country would gather enough moral courage to dream that same dream for itself. By faith, he led the struggle for civil rights until the law became an instrument of liberation, and the walls of segregation came tumbling down. By faith, he fought for a voting rights law because there is no right more sacred than the right to choose our nation's direction and its destiny. By faith, he campaigned for the poor and died defending workers, defending garbage collectors, fighting for their dignity, fighting for a living wage, as he carried out his ministry of addressing his words and his own body to what he called the triplet evils of racism and poverty and war. But Dr. King knew that he would not finish that work. Andrew Young tells me often that he would often just matter-of-factly say, you know, I'm not going to see 40. But he gave his life over to that struggle, died fighting for workers, fighting for their dignity. The tragedy of this moment is that the minimum wage in 1968 had more purchasing power than the minimum wage in 2018. So we've got unfinished business. Dr. King knew that he would not finish. Perhaps that's why he liked to talk about Franz Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. It's a brilliant, bold, and beautiful symphony, but unlike most symphonies that have 4 movements, Franz Schubert's famous Unfinished Symphony only has 2. And in a real sense, that's the way life is. We all pick up work that others have been doing before we got here. There was a McClendon, there was a Marshall before there was a Ginch. There was a Williams and a King and a Roberts before Raphael, Warnock. Before Martin Luther King Jr., there was a Martin Luther King Sr. and A.D. Williams. We do ourselves an injustice and we distort his legacy when we speak of Dr. King. Yes, in spite of his brilliance, when we speak of him as if he spawned ex nihilo out of nothing and nowhere. He was a part of a grand tradition, the black social gospel that Gary Dorian talks about recently in his magisterial volume. You ought to get it. It's part of a grand tradition. I stand here as only the 5th senior pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, founded in 1886. We celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. because of obvious reasons, because of the transformational power of his ministry, but he was a part of a tradition, young brothers. Long before Martin Luther King Jr. pushed through the voting rights law of 1965, his father, Martin Luther King Sr., led a voting rights campaign in Atlanta in 1935. 30 years before the voting rights law was passed, his own father was fighting for voting rights in the heart of the Confederacy in the 1930s, when you could have been killed for much less. Dr. King fought for integration, but before he could fight for integration, his maternal grandfather, the second pastor of Ebenezer, A.D. Williams, pushed through a bond referendum, out of which came the first public high school for colored children. That's what we were then, colored, in the 1920s. So we've had a public high school in Georgia for black children to attend less than 100 years. Dr. King attended a public high school that existed only because of the activism of his grandfather. So while we celebrate the luminaries that have come before us, let us not deify them, but to recognize that they are a part of a grand tradition, that we are in a relay race, that it is our job to take up the mantle and to continue that unfinished business. So we're dealing still with racism and poverty and war. And so this is the 50th anniversary not only of Dr. King's death, but of the Poor People's Campaign. And so let me just talk about poverty for a little while. It was Dr. King's last great push. He was arguing for the Poor People's Campaign. 5 days after President Johnson signed the voting rights bill into law, the Watts ghetto of Los Angeles exploded into an urban uprising. Dr. King cut short his vacation in Puerto Rico, made his way to LA, where streets were burning, and he turned to Bayard Rustin, his trusted advisor, who we really ought to talk about more often, Bayard Rustin. He turned to Bayard Rustin, that young brother who dealt with the intersectional oppression of being a black, openly gay man in the 1960s. And he said, you know, Bayard, I worked to get these people the right to eat hamburgers, and now I've got to do something to help them get the money to buy them. So while he had always been focused on poverty, in the last 3 years of his life, he became more sharply engaged on this issue, and he began to talk about things that would actually cost the country something. It didn't cost the country anything to integrate lunch counters. In fact, mainstream businesses flourished as a result of integration, and black businesses have not done so well. Didn't cost the country much to integrate bathroom facilities. Then he began to talk about the need for the restructuring of the whole society, so that by 1966, 2/3 of white America, South and North, viewed Dr. King unfavorably. Prophets are seldom celebrated during their own lifetime. Now everybody celebrates Dr. King. Both sides of our partisan bickering, conservatives and liberals, all use him as scripture in support of their cause. I often find it curious to hear folk using Dr. King's name to fight against affirmative action. They haven't read Dr. King, who said that if the country spent hundreds of years doing something special against the Negro, it only stands to reason that in order to level the playing field, you'd have to do something proactive for the Negro in order to correct that problem. But for everybody celebrates Dr. King nowadays, everybody. I saw a man stand and offer a proclamation this year on the anniversary of Dr. King's birth. And less than 24 hours before that, he had disparaged the whole continent of Africa and the people of Haiti, and then stood up to celebrate Dr. King. I jokingly say, because I'm the pastor of Ebenezer, and people always want to tell me about their connections to Dr. King. I cast no aspersions. I know some of you want to tell me your stories today. I do want to hear them. But I always laugh because every black person I know over 60 marched with Dr. King. There are not enough streets in America for the black people who march with Dr. King. But he began to say things that made us uncomfortable. So we're still dealing with this issue of poverty. And what has happened over the last 30 years or so is that being poor has become a crime. Poor people are the most maligned people in America. And the reason you know why what I'm saying is true is if you think about the presidential races over the last several cycles, politicians, both Republican and Democrats, very seldom, almost never say the word poor. Nobody uses that as an acid test for their campaign. Even while affirming their Christian identity, their allegiance to that poor brown-skinned Palestinian prophet who, when he stood up and laid out his platform, he said, "I came to preach good news to the poor." Yet everybody who runs and claims to be Christian, they say middle class, they never say poor. And the truth is, most of the folk that they're calling middle class are actually poor. If you miss 2 paychecks and you'll be out of your house, you're poor. Most Americans don't have $1,000 of extra income. A lot of poor people in America. And so Dr. King was focused on this, but we have maligned the poor. We've made it criminal to be poor. And then we have sacralized this ideology and made it theology. So the Kaiser Family Foundation came out with a study a few months ago that said that Christians, did you see this? Christians are more likely than almost anybody else in America to blame poor people for being poor. Preachers think about that while we're working on our sermons on Saturday night. There's something wrong with our preaching. Most of the people in our pews associate poverty with a moral deficiency. Even as we claim to preach good news to the poor, to open the eyes of the blind, to set the captives free, this ideology of values, this ideology of blaming the poor for being poor has caught hold and has infected the nation. And so whatever you think of the current political reality, don't speak of that which is obvious as if it were the thing. It is symptomatic of a deep spiritual problem. It's bigger than him. So we're dealing with this issue of poverty, and I could say much about it, but I'm going to press on because I really want to get at the heart of what I want to challenge us to think about. But let me just say, don't talk about poor people as if they're not people. It's easy to pick on poor people. It's easy to give tax cuts to the richest 1% in the country with this naive trust that somehow the wealth will trickle down. I mean, you talk about a kind of fundamentalist religion. We've been trying trickle-down economics for 40 years. It's not as if we don't know the outcome. We've been waiting a long time for it to trickle down. It's defying gravity. Somehow we have this religious faith that eventually is going to trickle down. I mean, it's not just immoral, it's illogical. Bring some analysis. It's not as if the evidence and the data are not already available. Nothing automatically trickles down. We've been through this. We've addressed these issues as a nation. We know that the market needs a good dose of correction, that you've got to have some, here's that ugly word, some kind of regulation. You've got to have some encouragement for folk to do right. The market solves some things, but this idea that the market solves everything is a kind of fundamentalist religious ideology. Most poor people are children. I was one of those children. I'm the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, but long before I was in King's Pulpit, young sisters and brothers, I grew up in the Caton Homes housing projects. People see your glory, they don't know your story. I'm a preacher. My daddy was a preacher, but my daddy didn't have all these fancy degrees. And I'm still striving to be half the man that he was. My dad was a Pentecostal preacher who preached on Sunday mornings in his little church on the west side of Savannah, Georgia. But my dad, Pastor Brown, was a preacher and a junk man. Monday through Friday, he fed his family, and there were 12 of us, by picking up old junk cars that other folk were throwing away, loaded them back on the back of a rig that he constructed himself because he was a veteran of World War II, had learned how to weld, was kind of entrepreneur, just an ordinary man making a way out of no way. Used to pick up those old junk cars, and they'd take them to the Chatham Steel, crush them and weigh them, and that's how he fed his family. He was always dirty and greasy, 5, sometimes 6 days a week, so dirty and greasy. When he came home, he couldn't use soap. You had to use Tide detergent to clean the grease and the dirt from beneath his fingernails. He was a junk man, Monday through Friday, sometimes Saturday. But on Sunday morning, he was the pastor of Triumph the Church and Kingdom of God in Christ, one of those Pentecostal churches where the name is longer and bigger than the church. He stood up on Sunday morning. He took off those dirty clothes and put on his work clothes, the helmet of salvation, the shield of faith. And he stood and talked to ordinary working class poor people and told them that they are God's somebody, that there is a junk man who goes around picking up stuff, picking up addicts and picking up people that other people have thrown away, and reminds them that there is a treasure in their trash. And so all of my life, with all of my MDivs and PhDs, I've tried to keep a junk man's hermeneutic, to recognize the lens through which God sees people. And in God's eyes, everybody is somebody. And so my dad didn't have any money to give me. And when I got ready to go to college, I decided I was going to Morehouse College. Martin Luther King Jr., who's inspired me since I was 6 and 7 years old, I was going where Dr. King went. That's all I needed to know. Dr. King went there? Okay, I'm going to Morehouse College. I'd never even been to Morehouse College, even though I lived in Savannah, Georgia. And so I remember arriving at Morehouse College in the fall of 1987. I went to Morehouse on a full faith scholarship. When I got there was not enough money even for the first semester. But my parents told me that I was somebody, and I believed them. The village embraced me, told me I was smart, and I was stupid enough to believe I was smart. Arrived at Morehouse College. And I have to tell you about my parents. They're Pentecostal preachers, mother and father. You know, they were deep in the gospel. They used to speak to me in King James English. Thou shalt wash the dishes, lest I smite thee with my rod and my staff. I arrived at Morehouse College, and I looked around, and the first thing I realized, Brother Peyton, is that I didn't have enough money to go to a black college. Because those brothers and sisters, those brothers at the school, they were already dressed like they were on Wall Street. Some of them had come from great families and were driving all these fancy cars. And there I was trying to figure out how to get enough money for the first semester. You know how it is. You've ever been to a black college football game? It's not just a game. It's a battle of the bands. It's a barbecue. It's a fashion show. It's a family reunion. Every now and then it's a church service. And there I was trying to figure out how I was going to get the tuition paid the first semester. And so I looked at my dad as they were getting ready to drive off, you know, asking them to give me a few dollars, you know, for books and that kind of thing. My dad was a loving father, but he was born in 1917. He came from that tough love generation. My dad looked at me and spoke to me in King James English. He said, "Son, silver and gold hath I none." I'm serious. "But such as I have give I unto thee. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ go with you." He gave me a great big hug. He and my mama got in the car and drove off into the horizon. Well, 4 years later, some of those brothers who were driving those fancy cars were driving by the stage, but I was standing on the stage getting my degree. Took grit, hard work, self-reliance, you want to call it that, fine. Determination, I had a whole lot of self-reliance, but I also had a Pell Grant. I had self-reliance, but I also had a guaranteed low-interest student loan. It does take a village. I'm saying that America needs to invest in its children. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. It's enlightened self-interest. Our young people are the best resource that we have, and you cannot lift up Dr. King's name and not do the best we can for our young. So we've got to deal with poverty. But we've also got to deal with racism. We've got to deal with racism, and we've got to deal with poverty. Over the last 30 years, America has made a public policy choice or a set of public policy decisions. The old industrial economy waned, and the new economy emerged. We could have prepared our young workforce for the new reality. Instead, we chose to invest our precious resources in the largest prison industrial complex in the world. It's a choice. No lack of resources. We need a revolution of values. Politicians have convinced us to think like the world is a zero-sum game and there's a scarcity of resources. No, there's a scarcity of moral imagination. If you thought the issue was resources, you should have been disabused of that idea when we went into Iraq. Spent billions and billions of dollars in these endless wars that have been going on for the entire lifetime of these young adults who are sitting in this room. Scarcity not of resources, but moral imagination. We invested in the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex. We've invested in the machinery and the weapons of death rather than in the instruments of life. We've made these decisions. And if we are to have a spiritual revival, we've got to confess. We've got to confess our collective sin and make a different set of choices. The land of the free is the incarceration capital of the world. We warehouse over 2 million Americans, about 2.4 million Americans. No other nation comes close both in terms of the per capita representation of our prison population or sheer numbers. We warehouse 25% of the world's prisoners in America. With 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners are in the United States of America. That's not a function of crime. That's a set of public policy choices driven by market forces. More African Americans under supervision than were in slavery in 1850. Is Jim Crow reinscribed in a new day? Dr. King fought against job discrimination, fought against housing discrimination, fought against voting discrimination. But now through the language of law and order, after you have served time in America's prison system, can I tell you, it's actually worse than that. After you've been arrested, not even necessarily convicted after being arrested, job discrimination is legal. Think about that. In juxtaposition of what you learned in your 9th grade civics class, that you're innocent until proven guilty. You all remember 9th grade civics? You remember watching Perry Mason after we went home and somebody accused you of something you didn't do, and Mason stood up with his brilliant lawyering and you got off and you went home scot-free and your life was good. But that's not the reality that poor people, that brown and black people live in the United States of America. That's what the Black Lives Matter movement is about, because often you're guilty and executed on the spot. But then the irony of this moment is that after you've been arrested, all of these forms of discrimination are legal. Check the box. Have you ever been arrested? So the church has a choice to make. It's one thing to stand up for Rosa Parks, whom Martin Luther King Jr. called one of the most respected people in the Negro community. It's another thing to stand up for poor people who are self-medicating and are then criminalized in America's so-called war on drugs, which has actually been a war on black and brown bodies. If you didn't know it before, you ought to know it now, because have you not noticed now that the addicts are white and suburban? We don't have a war on drugs. We have an opioid crisis. We have a public health emergency. Contrast in language is jarring. In a war, you have enemy combatants who must be incarcerated or killed. In a public health emergency, you have patients that deserve our patience and compassion. The latter is right, but it ought to add light on our treatment of the former. This is not a theoretical argument. I did pastoral ministry with Roger Ginch in Baltimore. We've seen up close these communities that have been decimated through 30 and 40 years of America's war. So I want to know, where's the restorative justice? What does repentance look like? Black families have been torn apart decade after decade. Fathers have been warehoused and made invisible, and children have grown up without their parents. Now we have an opioid crisis. Nobody ever talked about a crackoid crisis. I mean, the language even sounds more clinical and nicer. And so last year, our church put together an expungement event. I'm sitting down with the chair of the Board of Commissioners for Fulton County, and he and I, we're both Morehouse men, and Morehouse men, you know, we were thoroughly indoctrinated during our 4 years. We believe we can do anything. So we were like, what good are we going to do in the world? And so we sat down over breakfast one day, and we decided to do this expungement event in Fulton County. I don't know what it's like in your area, but in Fulton County, it takes 120 days for someone to get their arrest record expunged. I need you to hear me because most Americans do not understand this, but it's a reality for your neighbors. These are people who've been arrested, never convicted. In some cases, they've been to court and they've been acquitted of all charges, but somewhere out there, there's a record. And so you can't get a job. If you get a job, you can't get a good job. You can't get an apartment. So we decided to have an expungement event in Fulton County. It usually takes 120 days. You go to this office, and you go to this office, you go to this office, you go to this office, you pay a fine, and then 120 days later, maybe your record is expunged. We said, nonsense. We want all of these groups to come to the church. And so we used the moral authority of the church and his authority as the chair of the Fulton County Commission, and we asked the district attorney to do an unusual thing, cooperate with the public defender. And we asked both of them to cooperate with the judges. And we asked the judges to cooperate with the clerk, and the clerk to cooperate with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And we created a command center in our church banquet hall, much like this, so that people could come to one place, and we waived all of the fees in the spirit. In the spirit of the Jubilee, we said no fees. The debts have been canceled. They said, well, we got to have the GBI there because they have the record. I said, well, I got a problem. If they pull up the GBI record, doesn't that mean you get to see if there's an outstanding warrant? They said, yeah, well, if there's an outstanding warrant, don't you have to arrest them? Yes. I said, well, you're not going to arrest anybody in my church. This is the church. So a miracle happened. We convinced the GBI not to look at the page, which would tell them whether or not there was an outstanding warrant. So the only thing you could get was redemption. The worst you could get was, no, we can't help you. Let's see if there's something else we can do. And so one of the proudest moments in my ministry is when I arrived at my church on a Saturday morning, looked across the sanctuary, and there was a sea of faces. And it gave me goosebumps to know that everybody in the sanctuary had a record. But you know, I'm baptized in the Pentecostal Baptist tradition. And so I wouldn't be a Baptist preacher if I didn't tell you that that's true every Sunday. Everybody has a record. And they went to church with a record, and they walked out without a record. Hundreds of people. We've done over 1,000 criminal arrests, expungements. A few months after that, I was sitting in the barbershop. I know you find that hard to believe. It's good therapy. I was at the barbershop, and this man walked up to me and he said, Rev, that was a great event you had. Thank you. And, you know, I thought he was just thanking me for this event. It had gotten news coverage. I said, thank you very much, sir. And I was rushing to get out. He said, no, Rev, slow down now. You don't understand what I'm trying to tell you. I said, what is it, sir? He said, you expunged my record that day. He was a middle-aged looking man, looked middle class. See, politics of respectability. Looked like somebody who wouldn't have a problem like that. He said, 20 years ago, I had an issue with a check. I've gone on. I've had no more trouble with the law. He said, for 20 years, I've never been able to get a good job. I've been able to get jobs, but nothing commensurate with my skill set. He said, but I went to the church. and I got my record cleared while I was at church. That sounds right. And he said, as a result of that, I've been able to get a good job. My whole quality of life, Rev, has improved. And I just want to say thank you. I said, God bless you, brother. I was just deeply, he said, no, slow down, Rev, it's deeper than that. He said, there's a young couple in my family, and they had a young child, and they weren't ready for the child. And that child was about to go into foster care. Now, there are many great foster care families, but if you look at the data, you know that the outcome for foster care children can be very poor. It is a prison pipeline itself. He said, you know, if I'd had that arrest record, there's no way the Department of Family and Children's Services would have taken a look at me, but because you cleared my record, I was able to adopt my own family member. And so 2 generations saved, given a chance because of common sense, a view of grace, the Word taking on flesh and living among us. And so on June 19th, our church is going to have a cash bailout movement. We're raising money right now. If I weren't in somebody else's church, I'd tell you where to go and give, but I won't do that. But we're bailing out fathers and mothers in time for Father's Day. Because there are people sitting in jail right now all across America who have never been convicted of anything. They're waiting trial. They're there for days and weeks and months and years, and they're no threat to the country. They're there for nonviolent offenses. The only reason they're there is because they're poor. There's really no reason for it. But a lot of people are invested in brokenness. And so we recently got rid of cash bail in the city of Atlanta. And the bail bonds industry fought us because a lot of folk are invested in brokenness. They're not bad people. That's how systemic oppression works. We're all mired in it. The black bondsmen fought us. It's tied to their livelihood. So we got rid of cash bail, but we're going to be bailing out some folks in neighboring municipalities and those who are still caught up on Juneteenth. And so I'm just saying that America, but particularly the church, has got to stand up and continue Dr. King's unfinished business. The world's oldest democracy has persisted decade after decade as an insatiable, bulging, carceral state that routinely crushes and consumes black, brown people, and what it presumes to be poor white trash in the compactor of its criminal justice system, while it criminalizes the poor, the black, and the brown. Our immigrant system, in which young brown people, children, separated from their parents. If the church doesn't rise up and respond to this moment, we have no moral credibility. The judgment of God is on the church right now. And if we don't respond to this issue, we don't deserve to call ourselves the church. We've got unfinished business. We don't always know what to do. But Dr. King said that faith is taking the first step without seeing the full stairwell. And so keep the faith, sisters and brothers, and keep fighting the good fight. There are a lot of issues, but I would invite you to join us in this issue. Dr. King talked about racism, poverty, and war. The truth is we're at war with one another. We're armed, and we're afraid of one another, and we've allowed other folk to convince us to build prisons and build walls. rather than bridges. So Keep the Faith Baptist preachers have usually 3 or 4 closings, but I really mean it in closing. Sometimes I get frustrated and tired on this journey, and I don't know what to do next. And when that happens, I look up. And because I'm a preacher, I'd love to tell you that when I look up, I see something deep and mysterious, the finger of God as it writes across the milky deep in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. The truth is, all I see is birds flying by. But every now and then I see geese flying. And I like to see geese fly by because geese fly in a V formation. Pelicans flap their wings faster, but they don't go as far because they fly alone. Geese fly together. The one out front that is getting all of the attention and the glory and the sunlight on its face, the one that might cause the others to be jealous, is actually working the hardest. If you want to lead by example. Real leaders roll up their sleeves and they get in it. The one out front is working the hardest, but what I like about geese is that when the one out front gets tired, it just moves toward the back of the formation where the work is not as hard. And another one moves in its place. And the strange thing is that geese do this without a church schism. They do it without a civil war. They do it without one side of the geese formation deciding to shut the whole goose government down. Because geese understand that my individual location is not as important as our collective destination. They understand that the only way we get there is to get there together. And so we have to stand together and fight together and pray together and talk together, and sometimes argue together. But hang in there together. We've got unfinished business.